to this high-level plenary session as part of this Aid for Trade stock-taking event. Today we are joined by an extremely distinguished panel, the panel of all panels. I was describing it to a friend. And so first we have a warm welcome to Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization. We'll hear from Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization, Christolina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, David Malpass, the President of the World Bank Group, Angel Gurria, the Secretary General of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and Isabelle Durand, Acting Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. You see why I called this the panel of panels. And a huge welcome, a warm welcome to our audience watching this online. If you are interested in learning any more about the speakers, then their full biographies are available on the session webpage of this event. Just to give you a brief outline of what's coming over the next hour and a half, first of all, we are going to hear from Dr. Ngozi and then Dr. Tedros. Sadly, Dr. Tedros will have to leave after his intervention to go and fight the pandemic. After our panel offers their remarks, there will be some questions and answers. I have been told to highlight that some journalists will be joining us, and those journalists and everyone else here with us on Zoom can make comments or pose questions in the Q&A box here in Zoom. For everyone else, don't worry, you can still participate. For people following on YouTube, do post comments and questions on the WTO's social media accounts. To make sure that we get those, make sure that you use the hashtags, hashtag A4T, hashtag Aid for Trade, and hashtag WTO. And with that, my next step is to hand over to Dr. Ngozi.
Thank you so much, Somaya. And you're absolutely right. This is a panel of all panels, or the mother of all panels. I just want to thank my colleagues for taking the time out of their busy schedules for joining us on this Aid for Trade event. So welcome, Tedros, my brother, Christolina, Angel, David, and Isabel, and really many, many thanks from my part. This stock taking comes at a critical juncture. In the 3 decades before any of us had heard of a novel coronavirus, open global trade helped lift more than 1 billion people out of poverty. By tapping into cross-border flows of goods, services, and ideas, developing countries were able to accelerate growth and create better jobs. For the first time in 200 years, developing countries started to narrow the gap with richer ones. Yet even at the time, it was clear that many people and countries were unable to take advantage of trade opportunities because they lacked the supply side capacity to do so. That is why the Aid for Trade initiative was set up in 2005. Today, the pandemic is reversing hard-won development gains, adding to the problems facing the most vulnerable. The World Bank has warned that more than 150 million people could be pushed into extreme poverty, ending a 30-year downward trend. South Asia and Africa are likely to be the regions worst affected in terms of increased poverty and food insecurity. The pandemic provoked the steepest fall in global trade that we have on record. In the second quarter of 2020, the value of global merchandise trade fell by 21% compared to the year before. Goods trade subsequently rebounded, though not to pre-crisis levels. Services trade has fared less well, weighed down by travel and tourism, which in the third quarter were still more than 2/3 below pre-pandemic levels. Some services sector, especially digital services trade, benefited as workers and businesses moved online. Trade in computer services was up by 9%. The crisis is exacerbating inequalities of all kinds, from gender roles within households and societies to the economic resilience of countries. Least developed countries were hit hardest by the fall in trade, and have benefited least from the rebound. Preliminary figures indicate least developed countries' services exports fell 55% in the second quarter year on year, nearly double the figure for the rest of the world. For the first 3 quarters of 2020, LDC goods and services exports were down 19% compared to 15% for the rest of the world. Many low and middle income countries are on track for weak recoveries. Christolina has warned of, quote, a great divergence in which advanced economies and a handful of emerging markets recover from the COVID crisis, while most developing countries are left behind. This would condemn millions more people to extreme poverty in the years ahead. Our challenge this week and in the years ahead is to make sure this does not happen. The post-COVID recovery must not leave anyone or any country behind. The first step towards this goal must be a rapid global vaccine rollout that ends the pandemic. This must include global scale-up of manufacturing, including in emerging markets and low-income countries, with access to technology and know-how, whilst we work out the issues of intellectual property rights and the necessary flexibilities that also incentivize research and development. Such an approach would be the best global stimulus that money can buy. Closing the funding gap for the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, Act A, is an urgent priority. We have to ramp up vaccine production, particularly in developing countries, making the most, as I said, of existing manufacturing capacity and putting in new manufacturing capacity against the next pandemic. Countries rely on each other for the ingredients and components that go into making, distributing, and administering vaccines. We need more trade cooperation to address supply bottlenecks, lower regulatory hurdles to facilitate trade, and finance vaccine purchases. That is why I would like the WTO to work with members, with industry, civil society, and other stakeholders to see what immediate action can be taken to boost vaccine production. This will also help us prepare for future health crises. But vaccines alone will not prevent the divergence that Christolina talked about. Keeping global markets open is essential for a strong and sustained recovery. Delivering results at the WTO this year, including at MC12, would provide greater certainty and predictability for trade. Aid for trade will remain essential. Trade finance must also not be allowed to dry up. An important lesson from the past year is that trade made the supply of key medical products more resilient. In the first half of 2020, exports of personal protective equipment grew by 50%. Trade in textile face masks grew more than 6-fold. But there's scope to enhance resilience by making medical supply chains more geographically diverse. And this represents an opportunity for export-oriented investment in many low and middle-income countries. This jobs and diversification agenda ties into many issues being discussed at the WTO, such as e-commerce, investment facilitation, women in trade, and micro, small, and medium enterprises, and also the greening of trade. In fact, developing nations will need investment and assistance to adapt to climate change, build climate-resilient infrastructure, and build greener and more diversified economies. Sessions this week will explore all of these issues in detail, from trade facilitation in landlocked countries to building pharmaceutical production capacity in developing and least developed countries. Let me conclude by saying that I know development assistance budgets are under pressure. This is understandable, but we should remember that the organizations and members that have cooperated on the Aid for Trade initiative have made a huge difference in people's lives. We have documented some of this in our publication, Strengthening Africa's Capacity for Trade, which was released yesterday. Working together now to invest in the recovery of trading partners is not just the right thing to do. Building back a greener, more equitable, more prosperous global economy is a matter of economic self-interest for all countries. We can't afford not to. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, wonderful. Next, we are going to hear from Dr. Tedros.
Thank you, Somaya. And my sister Ngozi, and my other two sisters, Christolina and Isabel, and also my brothers David and Angel. It's a great joy actually to join you. And as Somaya said, I mean, she's right, and I'm really glad that we're all here together. I felt like actually welcoming Ngozi and showing support and confidence. So we cannot meet in person to welcome you and to have a party. So I will consider that this will be our welcoming together. And to others, dear colleagues and friends, first of all, I would like to congratulate my sister Ngozi on becoming the first woman and the first African to be chosen as Director General of the World Trade Organization. Very historic. And thank you for prioritizing this important stocktake to address the ongoing economic and health consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on global trade. More than 122 million cases of COVID-19 have now been reported to WHO, and more than 2.7 million people have lost their lives. But as you know, the impacts of the pandemic go far beyond the death and disease caused by the virus itself. Millions of people have lost their livelihood. The global economy is in recession, and global trade continues to be disrupted. I think Ngozi had said it. And although the global rollout of vaccines is giving us hope for bringing the pandemic under control, we still have a long way to go and many challenges to overcome. After 6 weeks of declining cases in January and February, we have now had 4 straight weeks of increases. And last week, the number of deaths rose for the first time in 7 weeks. Cases are increasing in most regions. These are truly worrying trends as we continue to see the impact of variants opening up societies and inequitable vaccine rollout. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we have known that vaccines would be a vital tool for controlling it. But we also knew from experience that market forces alone would not deliver the equitable distribution of vaccines. That's why in April last year, we established the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, which includes the COVAX Vaccines Pillar, a unique partnership between Gavi, CEPI, UNICEF, WHO, and others. In total, COVAX has now delivered more than 32 million doses of vaccine to 57 countries and economies. We expect to deliver a total of 237 million vaccines between now and May. Still, the rollout of vaccines has not been as equitable as we would have liked. Globally, 459 million doses of vaccine have been administered, but 76% of those are in just 10 countries. The success of COVAX is at risk because of the demands that some high and upper middle income countries are putting on the global supply of vaccines. This is not just a moral outrage. It's also economically and epidemiologically self-defeating. The more transmission, the more variants. And the more variants that emerge, the more likely it's that they will evade vaccines. We could all end up back at square one. And as long as the virus continues to circulate anywhere, people will continue to die. Trade and travel will continue to be disrupted, and the economic recovery will be further delayed. Vaccine equity is not an act of charity. It is the best and fastest way to control the pandemic globally and to reboot the global economy. Meaning, vaccine equity is in every nation's interest. Every day, we're engaged in discussions with manufacturers and leaders of countries at all income levels, exploring ways to ramp up the production and equitable distribution of vaccines. And we see 4 main ways to do this. The first and most short-term approach is to connect vaccine manufacturers with other companies who have excess capacity to fill and finish, to speed up production and increase volumes. The second is bilateral technology transfer through voluntary licensing from a company that owns the patents on a vaccine to another company that can produce them, as AstraZeneca has done with SK Bio in the Republic of Korea and the Serum Institute of India. Critically, bilateral tech transfer must include provisions for affordability and equity, which has unfortunately not always been the case with some of the vaccine deals done so far. The third approach is coordinated technology transfer and licensing through a global mechanism coordinated by WHO, which we have established through CTAP. This provides more transparency and a more coherent global approach that contributes to regional health security. And fourth, waiving intellectual property rights, as proposed by South Africa and India, is a mid to long-term solution that could help countries with vaccine manufacturing capacity to start moving towards producing their own vaccines. The TRIPS agreement was designed, as you know, to allow for flexibility on intellectual property rights in the case of emergencies. If now is not the time to use those flexibilities, then when is? When is the time? This is an unprecedented situation. My sisters and brothers, in some public discourse, the response to the pandemic has been framed as a choice between lives and livelihoods, between health and the economy. This is a false choice, a false dichotomy. The pandemic is a devastating demonstration that health and the economy are integrated and interdependent. When health is at risk, everything is at risk. But when health is protected and promoted, individuals, families, communities, economies, and nations can flourish. The pandemic will subside, but there will be another one. And countries will continue to face myriad health challenges that sap productivity, fuel inequality, and hold nations back. We can only truly respond and recover if we think of health not as a cost, but as an investment in the safer, fairer, and more prosperous world we all want to. And I would like to ask your understanding and my apologies also that I will be leaving you. I wish I would have stayed with you. We have a polio board meeting, which we scheduled for several months now, which I couldn't escape. So that's why I'm leaving. They had actually started some time ago, so I will join them. But with that, I think men will be a minority. There was gender balance, but I think it's okay to check how being a minority feels, because women have been a minority for a long time. But it's not wrong to be a minority. So thank you so much again, and look forward to working with you very closely and to make the vaccine equity happen. Thank you so much again. Thank you, and congratulations again to Ngozi. Look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sure we all wish you well in your efforts to bring the pandemic under control.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Great. Okay, well, let's turn to our next speaker. So next we are going to hear from Christolina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Sumaya, and feel free to call me Dr. Christolina. My fellow speakers, we are so lucky to be together with Ngozi, as she just has taken the helm at the World Trade Organization. Ngozi, you and I have worked together for many years. I'm sure, like me, you're just thrilled to see so many women now at the head table. But I also want to recognize men who stand up for women, and my very dear friend David Malpass, who holds on this tradition that we have to have strong presence of women in leadership positions at the bank. So let me go straight to the topic we have today. We are at a very critical junction of time. We have lived through the worst recession in peacetime since the Great Depression. And finally, we see the outlook for the global economy improving. It is thanks to unprecedented actions by governments to support households, workers, businesses, and also trade, to spectacular success in vaccines development, and to our ability to adapt with masks, with social distancing, with testing, contact tracing. So we now, at every junction of a new wave, function better than at the previous one. But these prospects for recovery are both uncertain, and we heard about the new waves, and most importantly, uneven. And as Ngozi quoted me, I do fear of a great divergence following last year's great lockdown. Divergence within countries, between those that are doing really well and those that are falling behind, and also divergence across countries. What we know on the basis of data is that advanced economies and a number of relatively small number of emerging markets are set to recover faster from the pandemic, and that some emerging economies and almost all low-income countries are at a risk of weaker growth. They have less access to vaccines, less access to global capital markets, less fiscal policy space. And to put it in rather concerning data, emerging and developing countries, excluding China, are projected by 2022 to have cumulative per capita income losses as high as 22% versus 13% in advanced economies. In other words, even as we go into the next year, to be much worse off than before the pandemic hit. And we also forecast that only half of the countries that were narrowing their income gaps relative to advanced economies will continue to do so over 2020, 2022. With most countries, both those that are doing well and those that are doing poorly, we have vulnerable people hit especially hard. Low-skilled, informal workers, the young, and women. So in that context, Ngozi, I could not be more grateful to you that you make the topic aid for trade a center of our discussion today. And I would use my time to highlight 3 areas for action and the critical importance of trade in each of them. The first I echo what you said and what that Dr. Tedros said. We need collective efforts to end the health crisis. It is so very simple. In 21, possibly also in 22, vaccine policy is going to be the most important economic policy. We know, and we heard it from Dr. Tedros, that we can't defeat the pandemic anywhere to the fullest until we defeat it everywhere. We know what is the alternative. It is the risk of new mutations threatening progress. And we know that it translates into focus on, as Dr. Tedros just said, scaling up production and distribution, especially in low-income countries, through COVAX, through what David Malpass is doing at the bank, and also through rapidly reallocating excess vaccines from surplus to deficit countries. The economic and development arguments for coordinated action are overwhelming. You have heard me quoting this number. Faster progress in ending the health crisis is going to translate into raising global income cumulatively by $9 trillion from 2020 to 25. And this 9 trillion split 60-40 between emerging markets and developing countries and advanced economies. And as Ngozi so clearly stated, trade barriers to access to vaccines and treatment work against our common interests. Unleashing the full power of trade to fight the pandemic is a moral and it is an economic necessity. Best value for money we can think of this year. Secondly, obviously, we are going to be all much better off if we leverage trade to drive growth. To secure a durable exit from the economic crisis, countries should maintain support to households and firms to avoid economic scars like long-term unemployment or fractured supply chains. So we stick to that message. And we also want to stress that as the recovery takes hold, governments are bound to lay the foundation for growth anchored in medium-term fiscal sustainability. I'm stating it because for quite some time, you would hear me saying, spend, keep the receipts, but spend. Well, I'm now saying you cannot withdraw this support, but think about what next and how to reduce scars in the future. Now, what does it mean in terms of domestic policies? Raising domestic revenues, making public spending more efficient, improving the business environment. And it definitely extends to global policies, re-energizing, reopening trade across borders to help boost the recovery. We saw a 9.6% decline in global trade in 2020. We are now projecting trade volumes to grow by 8.5% in 21, by 6.5% in 22. Step up on the pedal, make it even better. And to accelerate that growth in trade, policymakers can act at national level, for example, reducing import tariffs, simplifying custom procedures, cutting export duties. David Malpass is a very, very strong proponent on anything that leads to more transparency to inject more momentum in growth. And these measures can be complemented by international efforts to address the reform of the global trade system. And Ngozi, all the power to you. We all are saying, go, go, Ngozi, so we can see measures to resolve existing tensions, to bring a new momentum for trade. Particularly important as we consider the powerful impact that trade openness can have in reducing poverty and promoting inclusive growth. A rebound in trade, if it is managed well, can lift growth and living standards in the developing world, just as it did it over the past 4 decades when we experienced 11-fold expansion of global trade. And we know trade increases job opportunities, trade increases access for poor households to affordable goods and services. In your continent that is so proud of you, Ngozi, in Africa, a study shows that workers in export-oriented firms earn 16% more than workers in a non-export-oriented rivals. And another one shows that trade tends to reduce gender bias in wages. Now that we know women are severely hit, let's embrace trade so we can have progress also on the role of women in our economies. So let me just finish by saying it is the time to double down so trade can be again the engine of growth and opportunities it has been for so long. Let me move to my third point. Trade will be at the heart of efforts to build forward toward a greener, more inclusive, and digital recovery. We are going to experience structural shift to the new climate economy. It will depend on the exchange of goods and services. We will lift it up with new technologies that reduce the cost, for example, of renewable energy, that bring expertise needed to design cooler buildings, or to shift agriculture to drought, heat, and flood resilient crops. And as advanced economies invest in the green transition, we have a huge responsibility that poor countries also can do so. They can make similar investments, especially in the job-rich climate adaptation measures. And I again want to praise the bank for leading on placing adaptation at the heart of climate action in the developing world. So what does it mean for us at the fund? We were on the front line of providing advice to get countries move swiftly to policies that are justified in this time of pandemic-induced crisis. In other words, support workers, support businesses. And I take pride of the speed with which the fund shifted 180 degrees on what we advise governments. We were very proud to see that that also led to much more access to capital for emerging markets. But for those who had no access, we were there. We lended to 52 low-income countries, and we lended also for buffers in commodity-dependent economies through our flexible credit lines, about 107 billion. And we are now prepared to do more by focusing on the opportunity for special drawing rights to lift up reserves of countries. Of course, it is for our shareholders to decide, but I am quite excited that support is being built up in that regard. And I want to get to a, I recognize my time is over. I don't want Sumaya to start waving at me. So let me go straight to a very, very simple point. We have a chance to transform our economies. We have a chance to make them smart, green, more equitable, not to be missed. And we have trade to play a hugely important role in that regard. And Ngozi, one of my favorite proverbs from the days I was humanitarian commissioner and would travel to Africa a lot is, if you wish to move mountains tomorrow, you must start by lifting stones today. So let me finish with my very best wishes to you, to WTO, in lifting stones and moving mountains, because we need reformed trade to succeed in this aspiration for a better world for all. but especially for the most vulnerable people and countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Let's move swiftly on to our next speaker, David Malpass, the president of the World Bank Group.
Thank you very much, Sumaya. How am I going to match Christolina and Ngozi and Dr. Tedros? But thank you, Ngozi. It's fabulous to be here with you as Director General of the WTO. As my dear friend Christolina said, go Ngozi. Having women at the highest levels makes the world safer and stronger. You both inspire me. And I'm also pleased to be here with my with Angel Gurria, my colleague of 35 years working on the challenges of development. And I'm particularly happy to be speaking today or discussing trade. The trade facilitation and commerce are critical to alleviating extreme poverty, to boosting shared prosperity, and supporting the recovery from the pandemic. These are the core goals of the World Bank. COVID, as everyone knows now, is a once in a century crisis, an unprecedented setback in the efforts to reduce poverty and inequality. Let me go through that just as a scene setter. The shrinkage of the GDP, especially in the poorest countries, is devastating. It's resulted in cross-border investment flows that have practically stopped. There's deepening debt challenges. There's the pandemic has, we think, added 150 million people to those in extreme poverty. And the inequality of it is stunning. It's been unequal in terms of the impact. That is that the poor are suffering disproportionately, and it's through all channels, through illness, through job losses, through food supply disruptions, school closures, and the remittance flow, all of these devastating. It's also been unequal in terms of the access to the COVID vaccines. We expect to have COVID vaccine programs in 30 countries by the end of April with $2 billion of financing, but the supply of COVID vaccines available to them, to the countries through COVAX and through manufacturers is still very limited. It's a huge challenge for the world to progress on that. And there's also the deep inequality in the stimulus programs with the central banks of the advanced countries primarily supporting assets of the wealthy, and the spending programs are mostly go into the formal sectors of advanced economies. So these inequalities are compounded by the stark differences in the digital solutions that are available throughout across the world, the inequality of those solutions. So against these concerns, what the World Bank's tried to do, and thank you, Christolina, for mentioning adaptation and the trade work of the bank is critical. We've provided a record surge in delivery of our programs. We're going to be able to provide $160 billion over the 15-month period that ends in June. IDA will have provided $50 billion total on both grant and highly concessional credit terms. This is helping a lot. Our commitments in calendar year 2020 by IDA and IBRD increased 65% over 2019. So that's a record surge for the World Bank. And we've set up over 100 really COVID response programs, including in many fragile states. So this is an important outreach for both the COVID, for the therapeutics, for the personal protective equipment, and for the vaccines. And trade is going to be critical in this. And as I said, go see the WTO, the trade regulations of the world need as much support as possible. What we've done through IFC, the International Finance Corporation, is to support both trade finance and working capital, because when the pandemic hit, the correspondent banking systems and other parts of bank financing basically shut down for many of the poorest countries. So IFC has tried to step into that vacuum with huge increases in its trade finance and working capital finance. So I'd like to mention three areas of trade-related aspects of COVID. One is the trade performance itself. Second, the trade's role in the pandemic, in the response, and also the relevance for the recovery. As we look at the trade performance, COVID-19 disrupted trade in the early months, and that recovery has been robust toward the end of 2020. By our estimates, the decline in the global trade was less than in 2009. Well, as I mentioned, the GDP was hit more deeply, but trade in several areas was able to be sustained, including, and we were happy to see the import-export markets stay more open than in some of the past crises. The global value chains proved to be somewhat resilient in this crisis, and that I think has helped soften it a bit and allow the recovery to come into sight in 2021 and 2022. Trade was important in the response to the pandemic. In addition to allowing goods to flow back and forth, the rebound was welcome because the policies were tempered, and this allowed export restrictions to stay more contained than in the past. And finally, the trade is critical to the recovery. It's positive that the majority of trade measures have been trade facilitating. So we're continuing to work with countries across borders to try to open and allow commerce to go back and forth. This is particularly important for women, for new business entrants, because their markets often come directly from trade in both goods and services, and that's going to be a critical part of the resilient recovery. I want to talk a little about how that recovery can go. As we see countries continuing the effort and working with the WTO to reduce trade barriers, to reduce tariffs, that can add substantially to global growth. Our work, World Bank work, shows that the trade liberalization increases economic growth by an average of 1 to 1.5 percentage points. That results in 10 to even 20% income gains over a decade-long period. So we think trade and commerce are going to be at the core of the recovery process. It's now time, I think, to lower tariffs and regulatory restrictions, and we work with countries directly to try to support those efforts. And it's notable as we think of the range of environmental goods and services to try to have those barriers allow for better environment and climate trade to progress. And trade is also important as we think about non-tariff and trade facilitation measures. The trade finance is going to be critical to reviving, and so we're going to continue putting resources into those finance facilities. We've worked with governments to try to improve supply chains. We did a big report a year ago on that specific issue, which is so important for the ability of countries to find the right trade agreements to get into and to develop their e-trade systems in a most effective way. IFC has provided $10 billion in trade finance and working capital since the crisis hit. So this is a material contribution to small and medium-sized enterprises and other vulnerable companies that otherwise wouldn't be able to get financing. So as we look beyond the pandemic, and I have my fingers crossed, I'm pleased to see on a daily basis the increase in the supply of approved vaccines. As countries think about how they're going to develop. It's vital that they invest in human capital. That's especially true of girls and women. We think as many as 1 billion children are still out of school, and the gender-based violence has increased in those situations as strains, family strains have increased dramatically during the COVID crisis. Thank you, Christolina, for mentioning the importance of transparency. This is a vital step, both in the vaccine contracts, in the debt contracts. I think there needs to be more clarity on who owes what and what the borrowing conditions are. And as we go forward, I think we're making good progress in keeping in the data parts. And we're also working closely, very closely with the IMF on the common framework. It's critical to have it succeed in the goals that the G20 laid out for it in terms of providing debt relief and also then freeing resources for health, education, and climate as countries begin to think about and make progress on building forward. So we need to have as a goal an inclusive and resilient and greener recovery in order to create that environment for the world. We're calling it GRID, Green, Resilient, Inclusive Development, and that will be one of our goals. The World Bank has been the biggest multilateral financer of climate action. That amounted to $83 billion over the last 5 years, and we're stepping up efforts from there. We've committed 35% of our resources to climate co-benefits, and also 50% of that, so fully half, to adaptation, which has its biggest positive impacts in the poorest countries. Well, another thing that we're doing that's important and occupying a lot of bank time now is working with countries on their indices as they supply their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. It will be important that those are impactful on the climate. We want to see not just the spending, but the actual results be as constructive as possible, and also consistent with the development of the countries as the people look for steps forward. We've announced the creation of a country climate and development review process. So we'll work in detail, in depth with countries on how they can put together their climate efforts and their development efforts. And we are planning on 25 countries within that program. And one of the core is to how to achieve a just transition from coal to affordable, reliable, sustainable energy down the line. So those are key parts of the climate action plan that we'll be announcing in coming weeks. I want to conclude on the point of trade. Trade is the path for trade between villages, trade between cities, trade across borders, and trade in the global marketplace. This is the path for countries to be able to develop, and for people to be able to innovate and come up with new jobs, new ideas. And so a core part of that is to have the transparent and predictable rules. And this is where WTO has been so vital in finding pathways for countries to work together. We're putting out a new World Bank report on the distributional impacts of trade. That's what it's called. It'll be released next month, and it shows that trade can increase the opportunities for workers in developing countries to enter into the formal economy, but only if they're able to access export-oriented jobs. And that means improving worker mobility. So with better data, with better policies, with regulatory policies, and working internationally, my hope is that the World Bank Group can help policymakers come up with new techniques that really push forward against this burden of inequality that we're facing. So with that, I want to thank everyone for a great discussion on these critical issues, and especially thank you to dear friends Ngozi and Christolina on their efforts.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Our next speaker will be Angel Gurria of the OECD.
Thank you very much. Ngozi, great to see you in this new capacity. Great to see you all. As you said, there's the mother of all panels, or close to that. Now it's really my pleasure to address this Aid for Trade stock-taking event. We're meeting at the start of the Decade for Action for the 2030 Agenda. And of course, the COVID-19 crisis set us back at least a decade in terms of development progress. Indeed, we estimate that the annual SDG financing gap in developing countries increased by about 50% in 2020. So inequalities have increased. It is expected that income levels for women will fall by about 50% more than for men as a result of the crisis. They were already skewed before the crisis. Now, while children worldwide were forced to homeschool for much of 2020, 90% of students in sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to household computers. 82% cannot connect online. And we're far from equal in the face of the pandemic and the recovery. Our latest work on Global Outlook on Financing for Sustainable Development finds that, of course, the recovery spending in developing countries is several times, many times less than in OECD countries as we go into the recovery period. So the gap just continues to widen in the absence of fiscal space in many countries which face debt problems. David and Christolina were talking about the debt problems. Restarting the trade and the investment pump will be essential to the recovery. So aid for trade should be a focus of our official development assistance, of the ODA efforts, should be revisited to better respond to the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda and to the rising challenges and priorities of the post-COVID-19 era. Looking ahead, 4 concrete points on how to better exit this crisis. Now, first, understand that trade has been the glue holding the world economy together. Despite tremendous stress, global value chains have shown remarkable resilience and have proven quite crucial in dealing with the pandemic by scaling up production and distributing supplies. Medical goods trade actually increased 16% in the first half of 2020, even when the whole of the trade of the world was collapsing. So we need to continue to work to support these resilient value chains, from raw materials used in the manufacturing of drugs to the patients that benefit from them. The Aid for Trade programs can do precisely that. Help countries implement the necessary trade facilitation measures and the information sharing that supports this resilient trade. Now, while trade in world goods is rebounding, the recovery of services trade remains pretty mixed. Sectors such as travel, tourism, transport services have been devastated, with a particular effect on developing economies, which depend so critically on these sectors. Transport services declined by 24%, travel services by 68% in 2020, affecting most middle-income countries, and of course, what can I tell you about small island developing states, which just, not only rely heavily on tourism, are about tourism. Other services, however, including digital transactions, their key enabling sectors, have surged. Computer services was up 9%, partly mitigating the impact of the crisis. Now, given the preponderance of low-wage workers in services, a rebound in services trade will be necessary to foster an inclusive and sustainable recovery. As a third item, digital trade can play an important role in building forward better. This crisis has accelerated the digital transformation. It underscores its importance for sustainable well-being, for speeding up the recovery. But it has also underscored the need to address existing digital divides. This is in order to ensure that the gains from digitalization can actually be achieved, can be realized, and they can be more widely shared across countries and societies. And then, last but not least, governments should seize the current opportunities to incorporate climate-friendly policies into their recovery plans. Opening the trade channels, opening the investment channels, creates opportunities for diffusion of environmental technologies, as well as wider availability of environmental goods and services. This is why, those numbers, 83 billion in the last 5 years, which David Malpass alluded to, just in terms of what the World Bank has been doing, is so important. It improves supply security of inputs that are key to energy transition. It enables economies of scale to support the moves to a circular economy. Now, what is this Aid for Trade about? We're together here about Aid for Trade. Well, Ngozi, early in the time of Pascal Lamy, so quite a few years ago, we delivered our first Aid for Trade report in the plenary there at the WTO in Geneva. And we, of course, mostly the donors, they reported, that was okay. But we had 7 recipient countries. 7. They couldn't care less. They didn't understand. They didn't follow. They didn't know what it was about. I mean, we felt desolate, but we just persevered and persevered. Well, the last one was about 100, okay? Or more than 100. So it caught up. And year by year also, it was 5% and 7% and 10%. The donors started understanding that it was crucial because you can multiply the dollars or the yen or the euros that you donate in order to help with the ODA, because if you build a road, of course, a lot of trucks and cars can go in the road, but if the road leads to a port where you can then unload and put things on a ship, or if you can put chains of cold, so that we have to stop the rot. And what is the rot about? Rotten food, rotten production of things. A third of the food is wasted. It goes to rot because you can't get it out of the production places. So Aid for Trade is crucial. It not only changes the logic, not only changes the infrastructure that is allowed for multiplying the trade itself, but it also changes the nature of societies. And let me say something about the numbers. Christolina, I always quote you when I say 14 trillion so far, and that was, I don't know if that was before the 1.9 trillion, you know, probably now we're 15 to 16 trillion that we've thrown at the, how much is the ODA, the Overseas Development Assistance? 1% of that, 153 billion. That's the ODA. And imagine, you know, just 1% of that could double, could triple, could quadruple, you know, 1%, a little bit, you know, a little bit more and a little bit better. It's generous, yes, but it's smart. Just imagine, you know, if you incorporate in the aid for trade concept that vaccines are absolutely critical because they provoked the trade to go to a standstill practically, you know, and also that it's going to be very much needed, regardless of the humanitarian impact, just on the practical impact, so here the room in order to make a difference is enormous. As I said, it's generous, but it's also smart. So, dear friends, what the pandemic made clear to us is that we must ensure that trade and investment provide maximum development footprint in partner countries. The ultimate shock of the COVID-19 crisis is poverty or increased poverty. And programs like Aid for Trade are essential to build forward better. Without a sustained trade and investment flows, the strong, the resilient, inclusive, the green recovery we strived for will not happen. So as we forge ahead, only by working together with the right political leadership, we will be able to tackle the challenges ahead. So please count on the OECD to stand by you, to work with you and for you, and support you every step of the way. Dear Ngozi, welcome on board. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker, last but very much not least, is Isabelle Durand, the Acting Secretary General of UNCTAD.
Thank you. So, dear Ngozi, but also all colleagues, it could appear, or I could appear as the new one in the club, but it's not exactly the case, especially not for Christolina, because we know each other from the European institution, but trade and development is my daily life for the last 4 years in UNCTAD. And I would like to continue to contribute to the discussion, especially now with this the effect of this pandemic. Well, speaking after such rich and eloquent intervention is never an easy task. So let me try to go ahead without too much repeating the remarks of my predecessors. So it is a little more than a year since COVID-19 took the world by surprise. For some, this has been a lost year, but for me, it is foremost a year of loss. Millions of people have lost their life, Dr. Tedros reminded. Millions more have lost their loved ones, their jobs, their income or savings, or even their hope for a better life. We all lost the freedom to move or gather as we wish. We lost access to culture, which is so important for all of us. We lost our means to show empathy, affection through a hug or even a handshake. But we all, in one way or another, have lost something. If we look at the figures, the world is $6 trillion poorer than we expected it to be today. To reignite the world economy and leave COVID-19 behind, we need trade. It was exactly said like that by my colleagues. I know, of course, that I'm speaking to the converted, and I don't need to convince anyone here about the power of trade. But we need to make sure that we can make trade the engine for a more inclusive and greener world. And to make sure this happens, we need aid for trade. Trade is a constant engine of growth, contracted sharply, especially in the initial phase of the crisis. You remember, more than 140 export restrictions were applied to prevent shortages of essential goods. Trade then started recovering. But by the end of 2020, we still had a 9% contraction, and the recovery is uneven across countries and sectors. While trade in goods recovered faster than expected, trade in services is still in dire state. As previously mentioned, the survival of the travel, aviation, and tourism industry is a challenge never experienced before. And this touched the lifeline of millions of people, especially in developing countries. We all agree that trade also plays an important role for scaling up vaccine production and distribution. This requires easing vaccine-related supply bottlenecks, lowering regulatory hurdles, and facilitating trade. But the challenge does certainly not end here. Today's world is radically different than a year ago. Therefore, we must ensure that our nations are ready to adapt and prosper in the new landscape. Let me put forward 5 points. First, the capacity to fund and implement rescue and recovery measures is highly unequal across countries. And I give you just one example or one comparison to understand the gap. Developed countries, on average, spent around $1,400 per capita on direct fiscal stimulus. This is almost 80 times more than what LDCs can afford, or nearly 20 times the capacity of other developing countries. This will stimulate recovery in the rich world, but inequality across countries is likely to rise, and we are all concerned with that. To avoid a growing gap, we need to facilitate access to finance so that countries can react and rebuild faster. We must take action on the debt front, and as many countries with fewer resources are highly indebted, we need debt relief and not only debt rescheduling. We must avoid that their resources are primarily used for debt servicing and repayment instead of rescuing their economies and their livelihoods. Foreign direct investment, a critical source of finance for many developing countries, declined by 42% in 2020. And the outlook for this year does not look good, except for FDI in technology and healthcare sectors. For encouraging international private sector investment promotion and facilitation are key. And it should be directed towards sustainable development sectors to support the long-term recovery. Second, to ensure access to critical goods, we need to keep good flowing across borders. Trade showed its effectiveness to move goods from where they could be produced to where they were needed. The trade restricting measures implemented at the beginning of the crisis have shown not to be a solution. Most nations are too small to cater efficiently their needs without trade. And this is why most countries have resorted to lift these restrictions. And we need also trade because it is a powerful engine for job and income creation, and it is a critical source for foreign exchange. Third, we need to ensure that the digital economy fosters development rather than fostering divides. And the internet has been a blessing for dealing with the crisis and changed fundamentally the way we interact, consume, and produce. For instance, as businesses and consumers went digital during the pandemic, the share of e-commerce in global retail trade increased from 14% in 2019 to 17% in 2020. But at the same time, the digital divide has also deepened and threatens as unequal recovery. We just need to support developing countries in building the required digital skills, infrastructure, and regulatory framework so that they are not only consumers of digital issues, but also producers of the digital economy. 4, despite a steep decline in CO2 emission during the first lockdown and an estimated 7% reduction for 2020, we are very far from reaching the targets set in the Paris Agreement. Climate change, but also what we are not listening enough about nature protection, biodiversity are key, and it's our biggest threat. the tropics, the home of the developing world, are and will be the most affected. So we need to support these nations to strengthen their trade climate readiness so that they can participate and benefit from global trade tomorrow. This implies adapting production methods, identifying new comparative advantages, investing and diversifying their economies while building respective value chains. It also means to climate-proof their activities against adverse conditions. But these measures do not come for free, and they require funding, it was said, but currently only 3% of aid for trade disbursements are allocated for climate action, the SDG 13, so we can do more. We also need adjustment in the way we function, including in the area of trade, and we must ensure that our trading system is supportive of a green transformation, while at the same guarantee that the most vulnerable amongst us are not left behind. 5, and this is not an afterthought, we need gender-sensitive response policies as the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic is not gender neutral. Women have been particularly hit hard. Often they were the first to lose their job. They had less access to social protection and access to finance to enable their businesses to survive. They also faced a disproportionate burden of care work, and important issue, many girls were taken out of schools to help at home. This will have a lasting impact for our aspiration of a gender equal world. Therefore, I'm calling on policymakers and institutions to design and implement support measures that take the differentiated gender impact into account and support women specifically. So we need a recovery which leads to a world that realizes our aspiration, a future which is more inclusive and greener. I will not make the difference with my predecessor, but I would add that the asymmetries of the current system in terms of access to vaccines, gender, impact of climate change, etc., are no longer acceptable. And we need our multilateral forces to address these issues and find solutions. And trade has to play its part. Today, we can demonstrate our united front and commitment to rebuild, including through aid for trade. The post-COVID-19 world is still somewhat far away, but we cannot lose another day without working on the recovery. And Dr. Gozzi, be sure that UNCTAD is close to WTO in order to, in our respective responsibilities and duties, we have different responsibilities, but we are really allied in order to do something better for developing world. So let's not miss this opportunity, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Well, that's a lot of ideas, points to chew on. And at this point, I would encourage everyone in the Zoom room and also watching this on social media to send in your questions. We now have about 15 minutes to ask our distinguished panel some follow-up questions. Our first one is directed to Dr. Ngozi, and it's from Bryce Bashik of Bloomberg News. And he's asking about what we just heard from Dr. Tedros. So he endorsed the WTO proposal to grant a temporary IP waiver for COVID vaccines. Do you oppose this waiver proposal? And if so, why?
Well, thank you very much, Sumaya, for that question, and to Bryce. No, I don't oppose it at all. What I've proposed is a third way, because people are dying. And whilst we are discussing these issues, we need to be mindful of the need to move quicker, faster. There are two reasons why I proposed what I call the third way. First, because the discussion on the TRIPS waiver is taking some time. And the second point is we need to get access, equitable and affordable access faster to people in poor countries. So focusing on ramping up production, on trying to use existing capacity to increase the supply of vaccines, on trying to work on reducing export restrictions that are affecting supply chains. These are some of the ways that I thought we could really work on increasing production whilst we talk about the TRIPS waiver and the flexibilities that that requires. Now, you know, everybody knows why developing countries have been asking for this waiver. During the HIV/AIDS epidemic, countries had to wait. People died for 10 years before they were able to get access to produce the drugs generically. The H1N1 epidemic, rich countries bought up vaccines and poor countries did not have access. So there's a very solid basis. So we need to listen to what the developing countries who are asking for a waiver are saying. We need to dialogue with them and find ways of accommodating their concerns on intellectual property, whilst also making sure we do not disincentivize research and production. So in grosso modo, I think, as I always say, we can walk and chew gum. We can work with manufacturers to increase production now, whilst we also work on the issue of the TRIPS waiver and how we can accommodate the flexibilities being asked for by developing countries and respect also research and development. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel want to comment on that? Isabel, perhaps?
Thank you. Yes, I think that I agree that we have to find a rapid solution, because it's true that I think that the debate on the waiver on IP is really important and it has to take place. If it is not for now, it's for the future and for a lot of other goods in the health system. But I think that we have to find all the ways also for transfer of technology, because we know how important it is for developing countries to have access to transfer of technology in order to be able to produce. So I think that we have to mobilize all the possibilities to do something also so rapidly as possible in order to address the situation. Otherwise, we will have, of course, we know that the risk is that the vaccination will only start in developing countries, I don't know, the end of 2022, beginning of 2023. It's impossible. It's impossible for equality. It's impossible for the rest of the world. It's ridiculous regarding health, global health, and it's ridiculous economically. So it's why all that we can do soon as possible is, of course, welcome. But we have to work on the IP, definitely.
Great. Okay, well, let's move on to a question from Brigitte Bougisset of Short Rental. And so she is asking whether there is an exchange going on between governments who've had essentially good results, and I'm assuming this is good economic results or good health results, even before the vaccination drive. So are countries like China, New Zealand, Finland sharing best practices? Christolina, you're nodding. Do you want to jump in on this one?
The very first action we took at the fund when the pandemic hit was to create what we call policy action tracker, exactly with the objective to help countries learn from each other as fast as possible. We were faced with a very unusual crisis. We are still faced with a great deal of uncertainty. And in that sense, the objective of sharing what works both on the health front, but also on the economic policy front is absolutely essential. And we have seen the benefits of accelerated transmission and more synchronized policy response in this crisis, because we have done it, not with the fund, the world has done it. We avoided another depression. We are going to come up in a couple of weeks during the spring meetings with our update on the World Economic Outlook. And one of the new data we would be showing is how much the crisis would have costed without this synchronized policy action, without this fast learning from each other. And it is quite a dramatic difference. Basically, the difference between recession, yes, bad, and depression, which is, of course, much, much worse.
Great. The next question is one specifically for David Malpass. And the question is, how are trade aid provisions being adapted to protect small businesses from losses due to climate change disasters? David, can you take that?
Yes. So the adaptation is a critical and expensive challenge facing many of the poorest countries. And so what we're doing is putting more money into adaptation, working directly with the countries on their adaptation efforts. And then also, as I mentioned in my remarks, the critical priority of trade finance, also the correspondent banking problems. Those have been great impediments for the smaller countries, and trade itself, meaning trade finance, is vital for trade. So as we think of trade facilitation, one of the things is, as you're preparing to export your products, you need to have enough money in order to be able to wait for the payment to come in from the buyer on the other side. And that we have we've put out already $10 billion since over the last year in that, which is a big ramp up for the World Bank on that. So I think it helps a lot. I'd like to take 1 second and come back to the vaccine supply problem, which is to some extent a trade problem. It's also a transparency problem. So I want to support Ngosi's point on the third way, that walk and chew gum at the same time, that if we can, we need to find ways to build the supply. What we have found, so IFC has $4 billion ready to put into new manufacturing. The problem has been, or one of the problems, is the lack of transparency in the contract. So it's very hard to add supply when you don't know whether the current supply is committed. That goes into the options that the advanced economies are holding on vaccines. So I think one of the helpful things on the vaccine front would be for the advanced economies to give up their excess supply and their options on the existing supply, and that would allow more supply to be bought or to be developed, to be invested in, to expand the actual production capacity. COVID's probably going to extend into 2022, and so I think we need to be planning for the long term in building up the supply of the vaccines and also of the precursors. So we're prepared to do that, but the lack of transparency in the existing contract frameworks is a major impediment. Thanks.
Thank you. I had a question. I mean, so we've been speaking a lot about intellectual property, and one of the themes that came up in many of your remarks was export restrictions, and the danger that posed to the global vaccine rollout. We have a question from Julius Bizimungu of CNBC Africa, and I think there's a narrower question which I'll address to Dr. Ngozi, and then ask the rest of you to comment. So the narrower question is what countries in the EU are doing to limit the export of medical products and vaccines legal under WTO rules. And then there's a broader question, which is, thinking about the next pandemic, if we all agree that these export restrictions are problematic, what can be done to prevent them from coming up again next time? So Dr. Ngozi first, and then I'll ask the rest of you.
Well, Somaya, I want to start my response before I get to the narrow question by just saying that, 2 weeks ago when we were listening to manufacturers talk about the manufacture of the vaccines, one of them from Pfizer BioNTech shared that their vaccine requires 280 components that are manufactured in 19 countries. That's their supply chain. And this is pretty mind-boggling, meaning that if in one country or one place, there should be a blockage on some component, this is going to hold up the scaling of production of that vaccine all over the world. This is why export restrictions, prohibitions, and the like are to be discouraged. Now, under WTO rules, it is allowed that in case of national emergencies and the like, that a country can have export restrictions, but this has to be temporary. First, it has to be notified to all members. It has to be transparent. It has to be temporary, so there must be a limited time, and it has to be proportionate to the situation that caused it. So yes, to some extent, declaring an export restriction or prohibition is not against WTO rules, but it is very much discouraged that this be extended. With the temporariness of it and the transparency and proportionate are very crucial aspects. And that's what we're discussing or trying to work on during the pandemic. Actually, this is what WTO can contribute, that members limit these export restrictions and have very, very good reasons if they are to put them in place at all. So he asked about the EU, and of course, we've been discussing with the EU. The EU says they're the only area exporting vaccines to other countries and that they've made so many exceptions to the restrictions. But I can share, I did express my disappointment to them because it's also very, what should I say? The example, it's also very symbolic that the EU, that many members look up to, be seen not to be having these restrictions. So whilst we understand the politics of what they are doing, I've said openly I'm disappointed, particularly in the fact that they extended it from March. March 31 had been the declared stop, and now it's been extended to June. And I'm actively talking to them about how we can make sure that this restriction is dealt with.
Wonderful. Okay, we're essentially, we've got 2 minutes left. So I'm going to ask Angel to comment on that very briefly, and then I'm going to turn back to Dr. Ngozi to wrap things up.
Thank you very much. I think, we got a very nice case. One of the main vaccine producers provided for India to produce the vaccines where they need billions, and provided for Argentina, which has been feeding its own population, and of course, other countries in Latin America. So there you have, without having to work on waivers or whatever, just the practicalities of the flow happening. And it doesn't take away from the fact that they're selling vaccines. So I just say that because we get engaged in all these words, and they become more important than the problem itself. In terms of the latest comments, and in terms of I think there's a question of the whole strategy. The logic of facing the virus was badly organized from the very beginning, I would say. Everybody was lining up with their checks to prepay the amounts, and of course you needed to have the money to prepay. So this resulted, and because you didn't know whether it was going to be the BioNTech, or was going to be Moderna, or was going to be AstraZeneca, or was going to be the whichever, or Novavax, then of course you lined up in all of them, and you ended up with a multiple of the vaccines that you need. Only very recently, the United States just bought another 100 million, of a particular brand, and therefore now. So the question now is a time for reorganizing both the production. There's going to be a new production starting in April, starting in May. You're going to have hundreds of millions, you're probably going to have billions of vaccines available. But there is a delay in the process right now. There is a little bit of a clog. There's a little bit of a problem in terms of the production, how it's organized. But there will be the production. There will be enough. The question is, of course, how do we make sure that beyond the OECD countries, we actually get it to the developing countries?
Great. Thank you so much. This has been a really, really rich discussion. Thank you to everyone, and now to Dr. Ngozi for some wrap-up remarks.
Well, thank you very much. This has been really, for me, a very enjoyable session, very rich, and I hope the same for our audience. who also asked us really great questions. I wish we had had more time to field more of these questions. There's no doubt that what we have all agreed on in this discussion is that trade has contributed positively to helping to solve the problems in the pandemic by allowing goods, especially medical goods, to move more freely between countries, especially for those who have no capacity to manufacture their own. Could it have done more? The answer is yes, and it can and could do more. And this is what every speaker has emphasized by referring to the issue of vaccines. I think we've all spoken very passionately about equitable and affordable access to vaccines as being perhaps the best economic stimulus that we can bring, the best cure for the inequity that we see that was already existing in the world, but is being exacerbated now. And it's trade, in part, that can make these vaccines flow. It's trade, the dropping of restrictions or easing that can allow supply chains to work smoothly. We all accepted that poorer countries, developing countries, must have access. It is not a question of charity, as one of my colleagues said. I think it was Dr. Tedros. This is in the self-interest of everyone. If we want to recover from this pandemic and we want a robust economic recovery, there must be access to vaccines for all. And the ways to do it is to boost production now by turning around available capacity, especially in developing countries and emerging markets, but also to argue for access for the next pandemic. And this is why the TRIPS debate is going on. So we mustn't just think of what is happening now, we must also prepare for the future. As David Malpass said, I mean, this might go on for a while and we could be easing into a longer term problem. So I think we've all agreed on that. We've also agreed that part of what trade can do and has done in the past is helping boost the recovery. I think Christolina said a lot about that. And, the point that aid for trade can be a strong part of this. I love the very live examples that Angel gave about aid for trade and how this has helped us, help the world and help poor people do better. Isabel also very robustly supported that issue of what trade can do in so many ways to lift people up and how it can be used in this pandemic. So I think we've shown that trade is vital. Trade can do better now, should do better. And we need to make sure that trade impacts on the daily lives of people through the aid for trade mechanism. So thank you all for a very wonderful discussion. And it's really a privilege to have all my friends here today. Thank you.
Isabel, David, Angel, Dr. Ngozi, Dr. Christolina, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sumaya. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye-bye. See you soon, Dr. Ngozi.
See you soon, Isabel.
Yeah.
Bye.